The slap echoed across the mess hall like a gunshot. Sergeant Major Broderick's hand hung in the air for a moment, his face twisted with rage as he stared down at the woman he had just struck. "She's nothing," he muttered to the stunned faces around them. "Just another desk jockey who thinks she can mouth off to real soldiers." Specialist Elena Vasquez remained perfectly still, her cheek burning red from the impact. 23 pairs of eyes watched from nearby tables, forks suspended halfway to mouths, conversations dying mid-sentence. The morning chow line had stopped moving entirely, with Marines and soldiers craning their necks to see what had caused the sudden violence. "Think someone should step in," whispered Private Chun to his table-mate, but his voice carried no conviction. "That's a sergeant major. You don't just walk up to a sergeant major." The other soldier shook his head slowly. "She must have really screwed up to get him that mad. Look at her, though, just standing there like nothing happened." Broderick stepped closer to Vasquez, his bulk casting a shadow over her smaller frame. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned 2 Bronze Stars, and commanded respect from every soldier on the base. This supply clerk, this nobody who processed paperwork and counted inventory, had dared to question his requisition orders in front of his men. "You want to play games with me?" he said, his voice low but carrying across the silent mess hall. "I've been breaking little girls like you since before you could spell army." Vasquez looked up at him with calm brown eyes that showed no fear, no anger, just a steady assessment that seemed to unnerve him more than tears would have. She wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, then straightened her uniform blouse with deliberate precision. "Before we go any further with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed situations where someone's true authority wasn't immediately obvious in your community." Captain Morrison pushed through the crowd that had gathered near the serving line, his breakfast tray forgotten on a nearby table. As the duty officer, he knew he had to intervene, but the sight of Broderick's furious expression made him hesitate. The sergeant major had connections throughout the command structure, friends in high places who protected their own. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, addressing Vasquez while keeping his eyes on Broderick. "Perhaps you should report to the medical station to have that lip looked at." "I'm fine, Captain," Vasquez replied, her voice steady and professional. The sergeant major was just expressing his dissatisfaction with standard supply protocols. Broderick's face darkened further. "Dissatisfaction?" You little his words cut off as Vasquez's phone began ringing. The sound was different from the standard issue devices most personnel carried, a distinctive tone that made several of the older NCOs look up sharply. She glanced at the screen and answered without stepping away. "Vasquez here," she said simply. The voice on the other end was loud enough for those nearby to hear fragments. "Priority Alpha. Immediate. Pentagon Direct." "Understood," she replied, then ended the call and slipped the phone back into her cargo pocket. She looked at Broderick with the same calm expression, as if he hadn't just committed assault in front of half the mess hall. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "I believe you were explaining your concerns about requisition procedures." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, confusion rippling through the gathered soldiers. Something about the woman's composure, her complete lack of intimidation, was starting to make people uncomfortable. She stood like someone accustomed to being struck, or perhaps like someone who knew such strikes carried consequences the striker couldn't imagine. "What kind of supply clerk gets calls from the Pentagon?" muttered Corporal Walsh from the back of the crowd. "Maybe she's got connections," suggested another voice. "Rich family or something." Broderick seemed to sense the shift in the room's energy, the way doubt was creeping into the voices around him. He had expected tears, apologies, maybe a quick exit to avoid further embarrassment. Instead, this woman stood her ground like she owned the place, taking phone calls that sounded official enough to make his own stomach tighten with the first threads of uncertainty. "You think that phone makes you special," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "You're still just a glorified stock clerk who can't follow simple orders." Vasquez nodded slowly, as if considering his words with genuine interest. Then she looked around the mess hall, at all the watching faces, Soldiers who had stopped eating to witness this confrontation between a decorated NCO and someone they all assumed was nobody important. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions and growing tension that no one quite understood. Broderick straightened his shoulders and adjusted his rank insignia, letting the gesture remind everyone present exactly who held authority in this situation. 26 years of service had taught him that intimidation worked best when reinforced immediately after the initial shock. "Look around you, people," he announced to the mess hall, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless formations and briefings. "This is what happens when soldiers forget their place in the chain of command." He gestured toward Vasquez with obvious contempt. Supply clerks don't question senior NCOs. They take orders and execute them without comment. Several junior enlisted nodded reflexively, their training kicking in despite their discomfort with what they had witnessed. "Sergeant Major was right about chain of command," whispered Private Rodriguez to his breakfast companion. Maybe she really was out of line. But Staff Sergeant Kelly, a logistics specialist with 12 years' experience, frowned as she watched Vasquez's continued composure. "Something's not adding up here," she murmured to the soldier beside her. "I've never seen a supply clerk with that kind of phone. And look at her posture. She's standing like she's used to giving orders, not taking them." Vasquez remained motionless during Broderick's speech, her dark eyes scanning the faces around her with what appeared to be professional assessment rather than fear or embarrassment. The red mark on her cheek had begun to darken, but she made no attempt to cover it or draw attention to the injury. Captain Morrison stepped forward again, his duty as an officer warring with his reluctance to challenge a senior enlisted man with Broderick's reputation and connections. "Ma'am," he said to Vasquez, "I really think we should get you to medical and file an incident report." "That won't be necessary, Captain," Vasquez replied calmly. "I'm certain the Sergeant Major's concerns about supply procedures can be addressed through proper channels." Broderick's jaw clenched at her continued refusal to show proper deference. "Proper channels," he repeated, his voice rising. "The proper channel is you following my requisition orders without questioning my judgment. I don't care what fancy phone you carry or who you think you know. On this base, I outrank you by 6 pay grades." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably as his voice echoed off the mess hall walls. Several soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing necessary discipline or something that had crossed a line into abuse of authority. "Maybe we should call the MPs," suggested Corporal Washington quietly, but Private Martinez shook his head immediately. "Are you crazy? That's career suicide. You don't call MPs on a sergeant major unless you want to spend the rest of your enlistment cleaning latrines." Vasquez's phone rang again, the same distinctive tone that had caught attention before. This time she answered more quickly, and the voice on the other end was loud enough for half the mess hall to hear clearly. "Confirm status immediately. We show impact at your location." "Status confirmed," Vasquez responded without taking her eyes off Broderick. "Situation is developing according to protocols." "What protocols?" Broderick demanded after she ended the call. "What the hell kind of game are you playing here?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Vasquez smiled slightly, and the expression sent an unexpected chill through several of the watching soldiers. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been humiliated or put in their place. It was the smile of someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. "No game, Sergeant Major," she said quietly. "Just following standard operating procedures for incidents involving protected personnel." "Protected personnel?" The words hit Broderick like a physical blow, and for a moment his confident expression wavered. "What are you talking about? You're a supply clerk. I've seen your file." "Have you?" Vasquez asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or have you seen the file you were meant to see?" The mess hall had gone completely silent now, even the kitchen staff stopping their work to listen. Something fundamental was shifting in the dynamic, though nobody could quite identify what it was. The woman who had seemed like a victim was speaking with increasing authority, while the sergeant major, who had appeared completely in control, was beginning to look uncertain. Staff Sergeant Kelly leaned forward, studying Vasquez more carefully. Look at her boots, she whispered to the soldier beside her. Those aren't standard issue. And her uniform, it fits too well. Like it was tailored. Captain Morrison was starting to sweat despite the cool morning air. His instincts were screaming that this situation had spiraled far beyond a simple disciplinary issue, but he couldn't understand how or why. The phone calls, the woman's composure, the way she seemed to be taking control of the narrative without raising her voice or making threats. Broderick stepped closer to Vasquez again, trying to reassert physical dominance, but she didn't back away or flinch. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, holding it where only he could see the contents. The change in his expression was instantaneous and dramatic. His face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again as he stared at whatever identification she was showing him. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. "Is there a problem, Sergeant Major?" Vasquez asked, her voice still perfectly calm, but now carrying an undertone that made every soldier in the mess hall stand a little straighter. Broderick's hands began to shake as he stared at the identification in Vasquez's wallet. The confident swagger that had carried him through 26 years of military service evaporated in an instant, replaced by the kind of terror that came from realizing you had just made a career-ending mistake. "No," he whispered, so quietly that only Vasquez could hear him. "That's not possible. Your supply. I checked your records personally." "The records you were authorized to see," Vasquez replied, closing the wallet and returning it to her pocket. "Now, perhaps we should discuss why you felt it necessary to assault a fellow service member in front of witnesses." The crowd of soldiers pressed closer, sensing that something monumental was happening, but unable to understand what had caused such a dramatic shift in the sergeant major's demeanor. Captain Morrison tried to position himself where he could see what had been in the wallet, but Vasquez had been careful to show it only to Broderick. "What did she show him?" Staff Sergeant Kelly whispered urgently to Corporal Davis, who had been standing at a better angle. "He looks like he's about to pass out." "I couldn't see," Davis replied, his voice tight with confusion. "But whatever it was, it scared him bad. Look at his face." Broderick was indeed pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His eyes darted around the mess hall as if searching for an escape route, but the crowd of witnesses had effectively surrounded them. Every face was watching, waiting for an explanation that he couldn't possibly give without destroying what remained of his authority. "Sergeant Major," Captain Morrison said carefully, stepping forward with growing concern. "Is everything all right? You look like you need to sit down." "Everything's fine," Broderick managed, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just a misunderstanding between myself and the specialist here." "Misunderstanding?" Vasquez repeated, raising her hand to touch the darkening bruise on her cheek. "Is that what we're calling assault now?" The word hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, knowing they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this mess hall. Private Chin pulled out his phone and began recording, though he tried to be discreet about it. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison said to Vasquez, his voice taking on a more formal tone as he began to suspect this situation was far more serious than it had initially appeared. "I think we need to involve the chain of command immediately." "The chain of command is already involved," Vasquez replied calmly. "In fact, they've been monitoring this situation since it began." "Monitoring?" Broderick's voice rose to nearly a shout. "What are you talking about? Who's monitoring?" Vasquez's phone rang for the third time, and this call she put on speaker before answering. The entire mess hall could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. "Vasquez here. We have visual confirmation of the incident. 3 birds are inbound to your location. ETA 4 minutes. Understood. The subject is secured and cooperative. Roger that. Maintain current position until arrival." The call ended, leaving the mess hall in stunned silence. Birds was military slang for helicopters, and the formal tone of the conversation suggested official military communications at a very high level. Staff Sergeant Kelly felt her stomach drop as the implications began to sink in. 3 helicopters? She said to no one in particular. "They're sending 3 helicopters because someone hit a supply clerk?" Broderick was openly panicking now, his military bearing completely abandoned as he grabbed Vasquez by the shoulders. "You have to tell them it was a mistake," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. How could I have known? Your records show supply corps, nothing else." "My cover records," Vasquez corrected gently, removing his hands from her shoulders with practiced ease. "The real question is why you thought striking any soldier was acceptable, regardless of their assignment or rank." Captain Morrison was frantically trying to piece together what was happening. Cover records meant intelligence operations, special assignments, or worse. The kind of work that came with protection from the highest levels of command and zero tolerance for interference. In the distance, the distinctive sound of rotor blades began to echo across the base, growing louder by the second. 3 sets of rotors, just as the voice on the phone had promised. The sound sent a chill through every soldier in the mess hall, because everyone knew that level of response meant someone very important was very unhappy. "Sergeant Major," Captain Morrison said urgently, "I strongly recommend you contact your attorney immediately." Broderick looked around the mess hall at all the watching faces, soldiers who had respected and feared him just minutes ago, but were now looking at him like he was a dead man walking. The sound of the helicopters grew louder, and he could see through the windows that they were military aircraft, sleek and fast, the kind used for high-priority transport. "Listen to me, all of you," he said desperately to the crowd. "This is a misunderstanding. I had no way of knowing who she really was. Her paperwork said Supply Corps. Anyone would have made the same mistake." But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their faces. They were already distancing themselves from him, already preparing to deny any association with his actions. In the military, you learned quickly to recognize when someone had stepped over a line they couldn't step back across. The helicopters were close enough now that the windows began to vibrate slightly from the rotor wash. Vasquez remained perfectly calm throughout the chaos, standing with the composure of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. For minutes, she said quietly, checking her watch. "Right on schedule." The mess hall erupted into chaos as the helicopter sounds grew deafening overhead. Soldiers abandoned their breakfast trays and rushed to the windows, craning their necks to catch glimpses of the aircraft circling the base. Through the reinforced glass, they could see 3 black helicopters bearing official military markings, but not the standard transport variety used for routine operations. "Those are VIP birds," Staff Sergeant Kelly said, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "I've only seen those when generals visit for major inspections." Captain Morrison was already on his radio, trying to contact the Base Operations Center for information about the unscheduled arrivals. "Control, this is Captain Morrison at the main mess facility. I need immediate clarification on inbound aircraft and their mission parameters." The response came back filled with static and confusion. "Sir, we show 3 priority Alpha flights inbound to your location. We have no details on mission specifics." Orders came directly from Pentagon Operations. Pentagon Operations. The words sent a visible shiver through the crowd of watching soldiers. That level of command authority meant this incident had already reached the highest levels of military leadership, far beyond anything a simple assault case would normally warrant. Broderick stood frozen in the center of the mess hall, his face cycling through shades of pale as he watched his career disintegrate in real time. Around him, soldiers who had served under his command for years were beginning to step away, creating a widening circle of empty space, as if his disgrace might be contagious. "Sergeant Major," Private Chun said hesitantly, approaching with obvious reluctance. "Should I inform First Sergeant Patterson about the situation?" "No," Broderick snapped, then caught himself and tried to regain some composure. "I mean, that won't be necessary. This is just a routine matter that got blown out of proportion." But even as he spoke, everyone could see the first helicopter beginning its descent toward the parade ground visible through the eastern windows. The aircraft touched down with military precision, and within seconds, figures in dress uniforms were disembarking and striding purposefully toward the mess hall. "Routine matter?" Corporal Washington muttered to his table mate. When's the last time you saw a routine matter get 3 helicopter response from the Pentagon? Vasquez remained completely still throughout the commotion, her calm presence becoming increasingly unsettling as everyone around her descended into panic and confusion. She checked her watch again and nodded slightly, as if confirming that events were proceeding exactly according to some predetermined schedule. The mess hall doors burst open with enough force to slam against the walls. The first figure through was a colonel wearing full-dress uniform with enough ribbons and decorations to indicate extensive combat service and high-level assignments. Behind him came 2 more officers, their bearing and uniforms suggesting flag rank. The entire mess hall snapped to attention reflexively, even though most of the soldiers had no idea who these officers were or why they had arrived. The sudden silence was broken only by the continued noise of helicopter rotors outside and the sound of boots marching across the floor with military precision. "Where is Sergeant Major Broderick?" the colonel demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even senior NCOs stand straighter. "Here, sir," Broderick managed, his voice barely above a whisper as he raised his hand like a schoolchild answering roll call. The colonel approached him directly, stopping close enough that every soldier in the mess hall could see the fury in his expression. His name tape, Red Harrison, and the eagles on his collar seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights as he stared down at the trembling Sergeant Major. "Sergeant Major," Colonel Harrison said, his voice deadly quiet, "you are under arrest for assault on a protected federal agent operating under classified assignment protocols. You will remain silent and comply with all instructions from this point forward." Protected federal agent. The words hit the mess hall like a bomb blast. Soldiers exchanged shocked glances, trying to process what they had just heard. Vasquez wasn't just military. She was some kind of federal agent with protection that reached all the way to Pentagon command levels. Captain Morrison felt his knees go weak as he realized how close he had come to being swept up in whatever storm was about to engulf Broderick. The duty officer who had tried to mediate between them could easily have been viewed as complicit if he had chosen the wrong side. "Sir," Broderick said desperately, addressing Colonel Harrison while pointing at Vasquez. "I had no knowledge of her actual assignment. Her records indicated supply, corps personnel." Any reasonable person would have his words cut off abruptly as one of the flag officers stepped forward. The man wore the stars of a brigadier general, and his expression suggested zero tolerance for excuses or explanations. "Sergeant Major," the general said coldly, "there is no excuse for striking a fellow service member, regardless of their assignment or your assumptions about their importance. Your actions were recorded by multiple witnesses and represent a complete failure of military discipline and leadership." The second helicopter could be heard landing outside, adding to the surreal atmosphere of what had started as an ordinary breakfast shift. Through the windows, more uniformed figures could be seen approaching the building, suggesting that this response was far from over. Staff Sergeant Kelly watched in fascination and horror as 26 years of military service collapsed in front of her eyes. She had seen careers end before, but never with this level of dramatic intervention from the highest levels of command. Vasquez finally moved from her position, stepping forward to address Colonel Harrison directly. "Sir, the subject struck me at approximately 0745 hours in front of multiple witnesses. The incident was captured on at least one personal recording device and possibly base security cameras." "Thank you, Agent Vasquez," the colonel replied, using a title that sent another shock wave through the watching soldiers. "Your cooperation has been noted and appreciated." Agent Vasquez. Not specialist, not even an officer rank, but agent. The implications were staggering, and every soldier in the mess hall was beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple case of military discipline gone wrong. The third helicopter touched down as Colonel Harrison gestured for 2 military police officers who had entered with the second wave of personnel. The MPs approached Broderick with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting this was far from their first high-profile arrest. Sergeant Major Broderick, you are under military arrest, the senior MP announced formally. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to speak with an attorney. You have the right to have an attorney present during questioning. The reading of rights in front of his subordinates was the final humiliation. Broderick's shoulders sagged as the MPs positioned themselves on either side of him, ready to escort him from the mess hall, where he had held court just minutes earlier as one of the base's most respected senior enlisted leaders. Captain Morrison watched in stunned silence as handcuffs were produced and applied with professional courtesy but unmistakable finality. The metallic click echoed through the mess hall, punctuating the end of a military career that had survived 3 combat deployments and countless challenges, only to end because of 30 seconds of poor judgment. The brigadier general stepped forward, addressing the crowd of witnesses who remained frozen at attention. I am General Blackwood from Pentagon's Special Operations Command. What you have witnessed here today involves classified federal operations and personnel protection protocols. All recording devices will be surrendered immediately for security review. Private Chin's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket where his phone was still recording, but he hesitated when he met the general's direct stare. The officer's expression made it clear that compliance was not optional. Sir, Chun said nervously, stepping forward with his phone extended. I was recording when the situation began, sir. Thank you, Private, General Blackwood replied, accepting the device and handing it to an aide. Your cooperation is noted. Any other recording devices? Staff Sergeant Kelly raised her hand reluctantly. I took some photos during the initial confrontation, sir. She produced her phone and stepped forward to surrender it as well. Colonel Harrison addressed the remaining crowd with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. All personnel present will be debriefed individually regarding this incident. You will discuss these events with no one outside official channels until cleared by security review. Is that understood? Yes, sir, came the unanimous response from 43 voices. Vasquez moved to stand beside Colonel Harrison, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her posture shifted to something more clearly official. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read military body language. She was no longer playing the role of supply clerk. She was operating as whatever she really was. Agent Vasquez will be conducting follow-up interviews with key witnesses, Colonel Harrison announced. Your full cooperation is expected and required. The MPs began escorting Broderick toward the exit, his legs unsteady beneath him as the full reality of his situation continued to sink in. As they passed near Captain Morrison, the fallen sergeant major turned desperate eyes toward the officer who had tried to mediate earlier. Captain, you saw what happened, Broderick pleaded. I didn't realize who she was. Tell them it was an honest mistake. Morrison looked at the broken man with a mixture of pity and relief that he himself had avoided being swept up in the disaster. I saw you strike a fellow service member without provocation, Sergeant Major. That's what I'll be telling anyone who asks. The words hit Broderick like physical blows, driving home that even his own testimony would work against him. There'd be no covering this up, no explaining it away, no calling in favors from old friends. Too many witnesses, too much official attention, too many cameras. As the group reached the mess hall doors, General Blackwood paused and turned back to address Vasquez directly. Agent, do you require medical attention for your injuries? Negative, sir, Vasquez replied crisply. Injuries are minor and documented. I'm prepared to continue with mission protocols. Mission protocols. The phrase sent another ripple of whispers through the watching soldiers. Whatever Vasquez had been doing on their base, it was clearly far more complex and important than anyone had realized. Staff Sergeant Kelly found herself studying the woman with new eyes, looking for clues she had missed earlier. The perfect posture, the way she scanned faces like she was memorizing them, the complete lack of surprise at the dramatic response to her assault. This was someone who had expected this level of protection and official intervention. Private Rodriguez leaned toward his breakfast companion and whispered, "How long you think she's been here? How many times have we seen her and never knew what she really was?" The question hung unanswered as the last of the official party prepared to leave. Colonel Harrison remained behind with 2 aides, apparently preparing to establish some kind of command presence for the ongoing investigation. "This facility is now under security review," the colonel announced to the remaining personnel. "Normal operations will continue, but all personnel movements and communications are subject to monitoring until further notice." The implications were staggering. The entire base would be locked down because one NCO had lost his temper and struck the wrong person. Careers would be scrutinized, backgrounds investigated, and everyone present would be under suspicion until proven uninvolved. Captain Morrison realized with growing horror that his own actions during the incident would be analyzed in minute detail. Had he done enough to protect Vasquez? Had he properly recognized the seriousness of the assault? Would his hesitation to immediately arrest Broderick be viewed as negligence or worse? The helicopters outside were preparing for departure, their rotor noise gradually diminishing as normal base sound began to filter back through the mess hall windows. But nothing would ever be normal again for anyone who had witnessed what happened when Sergeant Major Broderick discovered that appearances could be fatally deceiving. Within 30 minutes of Broderick's removal, the base transformation was complete and visible. Armed security personnel had appeared at every entrance, checking identification with unusual scrutiny. Signs were posted restricting access to previously open areas, and the constant presence of unfamiliar officers in dress uniforms created an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Captain Morrison found himself summoned to the base commander's office, where he discovered a room filled with officials he didn't recognize. Colonel Harrison sat behind the commander's desk, while General Blackwood occupied a chair positioned to observe rather than participate directly in the questioning. "Captain," Colonel Harrison began without preamble, "walk me through your observations of the incident from the moment you became aware of the confrontation." Morrison chose his words carefully, knowing that every detail would be analyzed and cross-referenced with witness statements and security footage. "I heard the sound of the slap from across the mess hall, sir. When I looked up, I saw Sergeant Major Broderick standing over Agent Vasquez, who had visible injury to her face." "Agent Vasquez," the colonel repeated, making a note. "At what point did you realize she was not a supply clerk, as her cover identity indicated?" "Not until your arrival, sir," Morrison admitted. "Her demeanor seemed unusual for someone who had just been assaulted, but I attributed that to shock or training. The phone calls were concerning, but I had no context to understand their significance." "Concerning how?" the colonel pressed. "The tone was too official for routine communications, sir, and the callers seemed to have real-time awareness of events in the mess hall. When they mentioned birds inbound, I realized this was far beyond normal base operations." Meanwhile, in a temporary interview facility that had been established in the base conference center, Staff Sergeant Kelly sat across from Agent Vasquez herself. The woman who had seemed so vulnerable during the morning's assault now projected unmistakable authority, her questions precise and professionally delivered. "Staff Sergeant, how long have you observed Sergeant Major Broderick's interactions with junior personnel?" Vasquez asked, her pen poised over a legal pad that already contained several pages of notes. "About 8 months, ma'am," Kelly replied, still struggling to adjust to the dramatic reversal in their apparent roles. "He's always been demanding, but I never saw him strike anyone before today." "Demanding in what way specifically?" Vasquez continued. "Did his behavior suggest patterns of abuse or excessive authority?" Kelly hesitated, knowing her answer could end careers or validate concerns that had been whispered about for months. "He would get very close to people when he was angry, sir. Invasion of personal space, loud verbal corrections in front of others. But physical contact was rare until today." The questioning continued throughout the afternoon, with every witness being interviewed separately and their statements compared for consistency. Private Chun found himself explaining his decision to record the incident to a stern-faced lieutenant colonel who seemed particularly interested in what had motivated him to document the confrontation. "I've seen situations go bad when there were no witnesses, sir," Chun explained. "Something about the whole thing felt wrong from the start." so I wanted to make sure there was a record of what actually happened." "Wrong in what way, Private?" the lieutenant colonel asked. The woman wasn't acting like someone who was scared or surprised, sir. She was too calm, too controlled. And when she answered that phone call, the way she spoke suggested she was used to taking orders from people with serious authority. Back in the base commander's office, General Blackwood finally spoke directly to Captain Morrison, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen similar situations before. "Captain, in your professional opinion, was Sergeant Major Broderick's behavior consistent with proper military discipline and leadership?" "No, sir," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Regardless of any perceived insubordination, physical violence is never appropriate for correcting junior personnel. His actions were inexcusable." The general nodded approvingly. "That assessment will be reflected in the official record. Your cooperation in this matter has been noted and appreciated." As afternoon shifted toward evening, the scope of the investigation became clear to everyone on base. This wasn't simply about one incident of assault. It was a comprehensive review of leadership, security protocols, and the circumstances that had allowed a protected federal agent to be attacked while operating undercover. In the base security office, surveillance footage was being reviewed frame by frame. The cameras had captured everything, from Broderick's initial approach to Vasquez's calm response to the dramatic arrival of the helicopters. Every moment was being documented, cataloged, and prepared for what would inevitably become a court-martial proceeding. Word began spreading through unofficial channels that Broderick had been transferred to a military detention facility pending formal charges. The rumors grew more dramatic with each telling, with some claiming he faced federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Staff Sergeant Kelly found herself appointed as temporary senior NCO for Broderick's units, a responsibility that came with the uncomfortable knowledge that she was essentially profiting from a spectacular downfall. The soldiers under her new command looked at her with a mixture of respect and wariness, knowing she had witnessed their former leader's destruction. The base commissary buzzed with conversations that stopped abruptly whenever officers appeared. Everyone knew they were under scrutiny, that their own careers could be affected by how they had responded to witnessing assault on a federal agent. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty was palpable. As darkness fell over the installation, it became clear that this single incident had fundamentally altered the power structure and social dynamics of the entire base. The woman everyone had dismissed as an insignificant supply clerk had revealed herself as someone with protection that reached the highest levels of military and federal authority. And somewhere in a detention cell, Sergeant Major Broderick was beginning to understand that 30 seconds of violence had destroyed everything he had spent 26 years building. 3 days after the incident, the investigation had expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. What had started as a simple assault case had evolved into a comprehensive security review that reached into every aspect of base operations. Federal investigators wearing civilian clothes moved through the installation with clipboards and badges, interviewing personnel about procedures, protocols, and their knowledge of cover identities. Base Commander Colonel Reeves found himself in the unprecedented position of having his own installation effectively taken over by outside authorities. In his 30-year career, he had never experienced federal intervention at this level, and the implications for his own future were becoming increasingly clear. "Sir," his aide announced, entering his office with obvious reluctance, "Agent Vasquez is here to brief you on the ongoing investigation." "Send her in," Reeves replied, straightening his uniform and preparing for what he suspected would be an uncomfortable conversation. Vasquez entered wearing her actual credentials visible, no longer maintaining the pretense of being supply personnel. Her bearing was completely different now, projecting the confidence of someone operating with full federal authority rather than hiding behind a cover identity. "Colonel," she began without preamble, "the investigation has revealed significant security vulnerabilities in your personnel screening and supervision protocols. Sergeant Major Broderick's behavior toward junior personnel shows a pattern that should have been identified and addressed through proper leadership oversight." Reeves felt his stomach tighten as he realized his own command performance was being evaluated. Ma'am, Sergeant Major Broderick had an exemplary record with no prior incidents of physical violence in his file. No documented incidents. Bosques corrective. However, our interviews have revealed multiple complaints about aggressive behavior, inappropriate physical intimidation, and abuse of authority that were either unreported or inadequately investigated. The implications were staggering. If those patterns had existed and gone unaddressed, every officer in the chain of command could be held responsible for failing to maintain proper leadership standards. Careers that had seemed secure 3 days ago were now in jeopardy. Staff Sergeant Kelly discovered the personal cost of the investigation when she was called for her third interview, this time with federal agents rather than military personnel. The questions had shifted from what she had witnessed to what she had known and failed to report over the previous months. Staff Sergeant, the lead investigator said, consulting notes from previous interviews, multiple soldiers have indicated you were aware of Sergeant Major Broderick's aggressive behavior patterns. Why was this information never formally reported? Kelly chose her words carefully, knowing that her response could determine whether she faced disciplinary action herself. His behavior was concerning, but never rose to the level where I felt comfortable challenging a senior NCO without concrete evidence of policy violations. Concerning in what specific ways, the investigator pressed. He would get very close to soldiers when correcting them, invade their personal space intentionally. He made comments about breaking people who questioned his authority, but he never struck anyone before the incident with Agent Vasquez. The federal investigators exchanged glances, clearly adding her testimony to a growing pattern of evidence that painted Broderick's assault not as an isolated incident, but as the culmination of escalating abusive behavior. Private Chin found himself in an unexpected position when his recorded footage became a key piece of evidence in what was now being treated as a federal case. The video had captured not only the assault itself, but also the immediate aftermath and the arrival of the response teams. Private, the investigators told him, your decision to document the incident has provided crucial evidence for this case. However, we need to understand what motivated you to begin recording. Something felt wrong from the start, sir, Chin explained. The way Agent Vasquez remained so calm, the way she seemed to be waiting for something to happen rather than being surprised by it. I want to make sure there was a record of whatever was about to occur. About to occur, the investigator repeated. Did you have advanced knowledge that this confrontation was part of some larger operation? No, sir, Chin replied quickly. But her body language suggested she was prepared for conflict in a way that seemed unusual for a supply clerk. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison received news that would reshape his understanding of military justice and federal operations. He was informed that his role during the incident was being reviewed not for potential disciplinary action, but as a case study in proper response to assault on protected federal personnel. Captain, Colonel Harrison explained during their final interview, your immediate recognition that medical attention and incident reporting were necessary, despite pressure from senior NCO, demonstrates proper adherence to regulations and concern for soldier welfare. Morrison felt relief wash over him, but also a growing understanding of how close he had come to being swept up in Broderick's downfall. The military justice system moved swiftly when federal interests were involved, and there was little tolerance for those who failed to protect protected personnel. The base grapevine carried rumors that grew more dramatic each day. Some claimed Vasquez was CIA conducting counterintelligence operations. Others suggested she was investigating security leaks or testing base personnel loyalty. The truth remained classified, but everyone understood that they had been living and working alongside someone whose true importance they had completely failed to recognize. In the enlisted quarters, conversations took on a subdued tone as soldiers processed the implications of what they had witnessed. The casual assumption that rank and position determined who deserved respect had been shattered by the revelation that appearances could be completely deceptive. Corporal Washington summarized the prevailing mood during evening chow when he observed to his table mates. Makes you wonder who else around here isn't what they seem to be. How do we know that Cook over there isn't actually some kind of federal agent, too? The paranoia was understandable, but also exactly what security professionals wanted to avoid. When cover identities were compromised, it created suspicion and uncertainty that could undermine legitimate operations for months or years to come. As the investigation entered its fourth day, it became clear that the repercussions would extend far beyond Broderick's individual case. The entire command structure was being evaluated, security protocols were being rewritten, and every soldier on base was learning that assumptions about identity and authority could have career-ending consequences. And in a military detention facility 200 miles away, Sergeant Major Broderick was discovering that 26 years of service meant nothing when weighed against 30 seconds of violence directed at the wrong person. 2 weeks after the incident, the formal charges against Broderick were announced through official channels, sending shockwaves through the military community that extended far beyond the base where the assault had occurred. The charges included assault on a federal agent, obstruction of classified operations, conduct unbecoming, and violation of federal personnel protection statutes. Colonel Reeves stood before his assembled senior staff, reading from the official notification with a voice that carried the weight of a commander whose own career hung in the balance. The court-martial proceedings will begin in 30 days, he announced. Media attention is expected to be significant, and all personnel are reminded that discussions of this case with unauthorized individuals are strictly prohibited. The media attention was indeed significant. News outlets had gotten wind of the story through leaked court documents, and the narrative of a decorated NCO destroying his career by assaulting an undercover federal agent had captured national attention. Base security had been forced to establish checkpoints specifically to keep reporters and photographers from attempting to access the installation. Staff Sergeant Kelly found herself thrust into a leadership role she had never sought, commanding the units that had previously served under Broderick. The soldiers looked at her with a mixture of respect and uncertainty, knowing that she had been present during their former leader's spectacular downfall. The morale hit has been significant, she reported during the weekly NCO meeting. Some of the junior enlisted are questioning whether they can trust any of their superiors, and others are paranoid about who might be operating undercover identities. That paranoia had become a genuine operational concern. Soldiers were treating routine interactions with suspicion, wondering if the person serving their food or processing their paperwork might actually be a federal agent conducting surveillance. The atmosphere of mistrust was exactly what security professionals tried to avoid when establishing cover identities. Agent Vasquez had disappeared from the base as suddenly as her true identity had been revealed. Some said she had been reassigned to another operation, while others claimed she was preparing to testify at Broderick's court-martial. Her absence only added to the sense that nothing on the base was quite what it seemed. Private Chun discovered that his role as the primary witness with video evidence had made him something of a celebrity among his peers, but also a target for those who blamed him for escalating the situation. During evening formation, Sergeant Torres approached him with barely concealed hostility. "Nice work with that camera," Torres said sarcastically. "Really helped your buddy Broderick out, didn't it? 26 years down the drain because you couldn't mind your own business." "I documented what I saw," Chin replied firmly. "If Sergeant Major Broderick didn't want to be recorded committing assault, he shouldn't have committed assault." The exchange reflected the divided opinions among the enlisted ranks. Some viewed Chun as a hero who had protected a fellow soldier, while others saw him as a traitor who had destroyed a respected leader's career over what they still viewed as a minor altercation. Captain Morrison received news that his handling of the situation had actually enhanced his career prospects. A notation in his file commended his immediate recognition of the seriousness of the assault and his proper response despite pressure from senior NCO. The incident that could have destroyed him had instead demonstrated his adherence to proper protocols. However, the base's senior leadership faced a different reality. Colonel Reeves was informed that his command would be subject to a comprehensive leadership assessment following the conclusion of Broderick's court-martial. The failure to identify and address patterns of abusive behavior reflected poorly on the entire chain of command. The investigation had revealed that multiple complaints about Broderick's aggressive behavior had been filed over the previous 2 years, but most had been handled at the company level without reaching higher command. The pattern suggested either systematic failure in reporting procedures or deliberate suppression of problematic information. Major Patterson, who had served as Broderick's immediate superior, found himself facing his own investigation into why those complaints had never been formally documented or forwarded up the chain. His explanation that such behavior was common among senior NCOs and didn't warrant official action had been met with skepticism by federal investigators. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate participants. Other bases received new directives about identifying and reporting abusive behavior among senior personnel. Training programs were implemented to help soldiers recognize when aggressive leadership crossed the line into assault or harassment. Military law experts began using Broderick's case as an example of how quickly careers could be destroyed when personal behavior conflicted with professional obligations. The assault had lasted 30 seconds, but the legal proceedings would continue for months, with potential prison time and complete loss of military benefits. In the detention facility where Broderick awaited trial, he had plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led to his downfall. His military attorney had explained that the federal charges carried significantly harsher penalties than simple military assault charges, and that his best hope lay in demonstrating genuine remorse and cooperation. But cooperation was difficult when he still didn't fully understand what operation he had interfered with or why Agent Vasquez had been placed in a supply clerk position. The classified nature of her assignment meant that even his own defense preparations were limited by security restrictions. The base continued to function, but with an underlying tension that affected everything from training exercises to social interactions. Soldiers were more careful about their language, more formal in their interactions with superiors, and constantly aware that they were being observed and evaluated. The incident had fundamentally changed the culture of the installation, creating an atmosphere where everyone understood that assumptions about rank, identity, and authority could have devastating consequences. The casual camaraderie that had characterized military life was replaced by cautious professionalism and constant awareness that nothing was quite what it seemed. And, as the court-martial date approached, everyone involved knew that the proceedings would determine not just Broderick's fate, but the future of military justice when it came to protecting federal agents operating undercover in military environments. The court-martial proceedings began on a gray Monday morning with unprecedented security measures in place. The military courthouse had been transformed into a fortress, with federal marshals supplementing the usual military police presence. Media trucks lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking signal strength. Inside the courtroom, Broderick sat at the defense table wearing his dress uniform stripped of all rank insignia and ribbons. The visual impact was devastating. A man who had worn his decorations with pride for over 2 decades now appeared diminished and powerless before the assembled military and federal officials. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by a JAG colonel who specialized in cases involving federal personnel protection. Members of the court, she began, this case represents a fundamental breach of military discipline and federal law. The defendant's actions threatened not only an individual agent, but an entire classified operation vital to national security. The words hung in the courtroom air, like an indictment of everything Broderick had believed about his own importance and authority. Classified operation vital to national security transformed his 30-second outburst into something approaching treason in its implications. Agent Vasquez took the witness stand wearing a conservative business suit that projected professional competence without revealing anything about her actual assignment or capabilities. Her testimony was precise and emotionless, describing the assault as simply another occupational hazard she had been trained to handle. The defendant approached me in an aggressive manner, she stated in response to the prosecutor's questions. He accused me of questioning his authority and insubordination. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation through professional dialogue, He struck me across the face with sufficient force to cause injury and bleeding. Defense attorney Major Stevens attempted to establish that Broderick's actions, while inappropriate, were the result of reasonable confusion about Vasquez's identity and authority. His cross-examination focused on the cover identity that had been established for her assignment. Agent Vasquez, isn't it true that your cover documentation deliberately portrayed you as a junior enlisted supply specialist with no special authority or protection? Stevens asked. That is correct, Vasquez replied calmly. Cover identities are designed to be convincing to prevent compromise of classified operations. And isn't it reasonable that a senior NCO would treat someone with those apparent credentials differently than they would treat a federal agent? Stevens continued. Nothing in my behavior or responses justified physical violence. Vasquez responded firmly. Military regulations prohibit assault regardless of rank or perceived authority. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Private Chin's video footage was played multiple times, showing clearly that Vasquez had made no threatening moves or aggressive gestures before being struck. Character witnesses testified about Broderick's pattern of increasingly aggressive behavior toward subordinates. Staff Sergeant Kelly's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. When asked about Broderick's leadership style, she described a pattern of intimidation and physical posturing that had escalated over the months preceding the assault. He would get very close to soldiers when he was angry, she testified, invading personal space, making comments about breaking people who challenged him. Several junior enlisted soldiers had expressed concerns about his behavior, but most were afraid to file formal complaints. Captain Morrison's testimony reinforced the prosecution's narrative that reasonable officers had immediately recognized the assault as inappropriate and potentially criminal. His immediate call for medical attention and incident reporting demonstrated that proper protocol required intervention, not tolerance. The defense's case struggled against the weight of evidence and the federal jurisdiction that elevated simple assault into a national security matter. Character witnesses testified about Broderick's distinguished service record and previous acts of courage and leadership, but their testimony seemed inadequate against video evidence of violence. Major Stevens called several soldiers who had served under Broderick's command, hoping to establish that his aggressive leadership style was within normal military parameters. However, their testimony often reinforced prosecution arguments about patterns of inappropriate behavior. He was demanding but fair, testified Sergeant Williams, one of Broderick's former subordinates. But he could get really intense when he felt disrespected. Sometimes it felt like he was looking for reasons to assert his authority. The prosecution's cross-examination was devastating. So you're saying the defendant was looking for confrontations where he could demonstrate his power over subordinates? The prosecutor asked. I wouldn't put it that way exactly, Williams replied, but his discomfort was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. During recess, conversations in the courthouse corridors revealed how deeply the case had affected military personnel's understanding of their own vulnerability. Officers spoke in hushed tones about the implications of federal agents operating undercover within their commands, while enlisted soldiers wondered whether their own casual interactions might someday be scrutinized at this level. The media coverage had drawn attention from military families across the country. Television news programs featured panels of retired officers debating whether Broderick's case represented isolated misconduct or a broader problem with military culture and leadership accountability. Social media discussions ranged from support for Broderick as a victim of federal overreach to condemnation of his actions as representative of systemic abuse within military hierarchies. The case had become a flashpoint for broader discussions about authority, accountability, and the protection of vulnerable personnel. As the trial entered its second week, it became clear that the verdict would send a message far beyond Broderick's individual fate. The military justice system was being watched by federal agencies, Congress, and the public to see whether it would hold senior personnel accountable for actions that compromise national security operations. Broderick himself appeared increasingly isolated as the proceedings continued. Former friends and colleagues maintained their distance, understanding that association with him could damage their own careers. The man who had once commanded respect through fear and intimidation now sat alone, watching his legacy crumble under the weight of 30 seconds of poor judgment. The prosecution's final witness took the courtroom by complete surprise. General Blackwood himself entered the witness box, his presence immediately elevating the proceedings to a level that made everyone understand this case had implications far beyond military discipline. "General," the prosecutor began, "please describe for the court the nature of Agent Vasquez's assignment and the potential damage caused by the defendant's assault." Blackwood's response was measured but devastating. Agent Vasquez was conducting a classified counterintelligence operation designed to identify security vulnerabilities in our personnel protection protocols. The defendant's assault not only compromised her cover, but potentially exposed an entire network of similar operations across multiple installations. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Broderick's 30-second outburst hadn't just harmed one person. It had potentially damaged national security operations that had taken months or years to establish. The compromise of this operation required immediate extraction of Agent Vasquez and termination of related assignments. General Blackwood continued. The financial cost alone exceeds $2 million, not including the strategic intelligence value that has been lost. Defense attorney Major Stevens attempted to challenge the characterization during cross-examination, but his questions only reinforced the magnitude of Broderick's mistake. "General, isn't it true that these operations carry inherent risks, and that cover identity compromise is always a possibility?" Stevens asked. "Certainly," General Blackwood replied. "However, compromise through criminal assault by military personnel represents a failure of the basic trust and discipline that makes such operations possible." The general's testimony effectively ended any hope the defense might have had for a lenient verdict. When a three-star general testified that your actions had damaged national security and cost millions of dollars, military justice tended to respond with maximum severity. During the final day of testimony, Broderick himself took the stand in a desperate attempt to humanize his situation and demonstrate remorse. His voice cracked as he addressed the court directly. "I served this country for 26 years, he said, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the witness stand. "I made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger, but I never intended to harm national security or compromise any operation." The prosecutor's cross-examination was methodical and merciless. "Sergeant Major, you struck Agent Vasquez because you believed she was questioning your authority. Is that correct?" "Yes," Broderick admitted. "And you believed that your rank gave you the right to use physical violence to maintain that authority?" The prosecutor continued. "I was wrong," Broderick replied. "I know that now." The prosecutor pressed forward. "But at the time of the assault, you believed you were justified in striking a subordinate who challenged you?" Broderick's silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before he finally answered. "Yes." That admission sealed his fate. The prosecution had established not just that he had committed assault, but that he had done so believing he was justified, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of military authority and discipline. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with the courtroom packed with military personnel, federal officials, and media representatives. The prosecution's closing statement was delivered with the precision of a military operation itself. "Members of the court, this case is about more than one moment of violence. It's about the trust that must exist between military and federal personnel, the discipline that separates professional soldiers from thugs, and the accountability that protects those who serve our nation in dangerous and classified assignments." Major Stevens delivered an impassioned defense that focused on Broderick's service record and the confusion created by Vasquez's cover identity. His closing argument emphasized human frailty and the pressures of military leadership. Sergeant Major Broderick made a terrible mistake, but it was the mistake of a dedicated soldier who had served his country with honor for over 2 decades. The punishment should fit the crime, not destroy a life in service to political considerations. The court deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the president of the court-martial panel stood to deliver the findings. On the charge of assault on a federal agent, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of classified operations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of violation of federal personnel protection statutes, we find the defendant guilty. Broderick's shoulders sagged with each guilty verdict, his 26-year career officially ending with the sound of legal condemnation. His wife, sitting in the gallery, covered her face with her hands as the reality of their situation became inescapable. The sentencing phase began immediately, with the prosecution calling for maximum punishment to send a clear message about the consequences of compromising federal operations. They requested dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 5 years. The defense pleaded for leniency based on Broderick's service record and family circumstances, but their arguments seemed inadequate against the weight of the evidence and the testimony about national security implications. General Blackwood remained in the courtroom for the sentencing, his presence serving as a reminder that the highest levels of military command were watching to see how seriously the justice system would treat threats to federal operations. The media representatives prepared their reports, knowing that the verdict would be national news within hours. The case had become a symbol of accountability in military leadership and the protection of federal agents operating in dangerous environments. As the court prepared to announce the sentence, everyone understood that the decision would send a message that extended far beyond the individual fate of one disgraced NCO. The military justice system was making a statement about the kind of behavior it would tolerate when national security was at stake. Broderick stood at attention for what would be the last time in his military career, waiting to learn the price of 30 seconds of violence that had destroyed everything he had spent a lifetime building. The judge advocate presiding over the court-martial stood with the gravity befitting a decision that would resonate throughout the military justice system for years to come. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as he prepared to deliver the sentence that would determine not only Broderick's fate, but also establish precedent for future cases involving federal agent protection. Sergeant Major Broderick, the judge began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "You have been found guilty on all charges. Your actions represent a fundamental breach of military discipline and a threat to national security operations that this court cannot and will not tolerate." Broderick remained at attention, his face pale, but composed as he faced the destruction of everything he had worked toward for over 2 decades. Behind him in the gallery, his wife clutched the hand of their teenage daughter, both understanding that their lives were about to change forever. "The court sentences you to dismissal from the United States Army," the judge continued, each word hitting like a physical blow. "Forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction to the grade of private, and confinement for a period of 4 years." The sentence was devastating, but not quite the maximum the prosecution had requested. The reduction of confinement from 5 to 4 years suggested the court had given some consideration to Broderick's service record, but the other elements of the punishment were absolute and irreversible. General Blackwood nodded approvingly from his seat in the gallery, understanding that the sentence sent exactly the message federal agencies needed to hear. Military personnel who compromised classified operations through criminal behavior would face severe consequences regardless of their previous service or rank. In the media section, reporters immediately began filing stories that would make national headlines within hours. The case had captured public attention as a symbol of accountability in military leadership, and the sentence would be analyzed and debated on news programs throughout the evening. Staff Sergeant Kelly, who had traveled to the courthouse to witness the conclusion of the case that had transformed her own career, felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but watching a senior NCO's career destroyed was sobering even when that destruction was deserved. Captain Morrison sat in the gallery feeling vindicated in his decision to immediately recognize the seriousness of the assault. His proper response had protected his own career, while Broderick's failure to control his temper had destroyed everything. The contrast demonstrated how quickly military careers could diverge based on individual choices. Private Chun watched from the back of the courtroom, knowing that his decision to record the incident had provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. Some soldiers still blamed him for Broderick's downfall, but the court proceedings had validated his belief that documenting the assault was the right thing to do. Agent Vasquez was not present for the sentencing, having been reassigned to another classified operation following the compromise of her cover identity. Her absence served as a reminder that federal agents continued their dangerous work even while those who threatened them faced justice. As the court-martial concluded and the participants began filing out of the courtroom, conversations in the corridors revealed how deeply the case had affected military thinking about authority, accountability, and the protection of federal personnel operating within military environments. The sentence will send a clear message, observed Colonel Harrison to a group of senior officers. Physical violence against any service member is unacceptable, but assault on federal agents conducting classified operations will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military and civilian law. Defense attorney Major Stevens expressed disappointment with the sentence, but acknowledged that his client's actions had made a harsh punishment inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, and the national security implications made leniency almost impossible, he told reporters outside the courthouse. Back at the base where the incident had occurred, news of the sentence spread quickly through both official and unofficial channels. The 4-year confinement term was longer than many had expected, driving home the message that the military justice system would not treat assault on federal agents as a minor disciplinary matter. Colonel Reeves briefed his senior staff on the implications of the sentence for base operations and leadership accountability. This case demonstrates that our responsibility extends beyond managing obvious security threats. He emphasized, we must also protect federal personnel operating undercover within our commands, even when we're not aware of their true identities. The base had implemented new training programs focused on recognizing and preventing abusive behavior among senior personnel. The Broderick case had become a mandatory study topic for leadership courses, ensuring that future commanders understood the potential consequences of failing to address aggressive behavior. In the military prison where Broderick would serve his sentence, officials prepared to process an inmate whose case had received unprecedented attention. His status as a former senior NCO convicted of assaulting a federal agent would make his incarceration both symbolic and challenging. The ripple effects of the case continued to spread throughout the military justice system. Other bases implemented enhanced screening procedures for detecting abusive leadership patterns, while federal agencies revised their protocols for protecting agents operating undercover in military environments. Military law experts began incorporating the Broderick case into their teaching curricula, using it as an example of how quickly careers could be destroyed when personal behavior conflicted with professional obligations and national security requirements. The case had fundamentally changed how military personnel understood their relationship with federal agencies and the potential presence of classified operations within their own installations. The casual assumption that everyone was exactly who they appear to be had been replaced by awareness that appearances could be deliberately deceptive. As Broderick was led away to begin his confinement, he understood that his legacy would forever be defined by 30 seconds of violence that had cost him everything. The decorated NCO, who had served 3 combat tours, would be remembered as the man who destroyed his career by assaulting a federal agent in a military mess hall. The courtroom emptied slowly, participants and observers processing the implications of a case that had begun with a simple slap and ended with a sentence that would reverberate through military and federal law enforcement communities for years to come. 6 months after the court-martial concluded, the base had transformed into something fundamentally different from the installation where Sergeant Major Broderick had once held court in the mess hall. New protocols governed everything from personnel interactions to security awareness, and the casual atmosphere that had once characterized military life had been replaced by professional vigilance. Staff Sergeant Kelly, now promoted to Sergeant First Class, stood before the same mess hall where the incident had occurred, addressing a group of newly arrived soldiers during their orientation briefing. The story of what happened here has become mandatory training throughout the Army, she explained. It demonstrates that respect for fellow service members isn't optional, regardless of rank or apparent position. The new arrivals listened with a mixture of attention and skepticism that characterized young soldiers. But their questions revealed genuine understanding of the stakes involved. One private asked, "How are we supposed to know if someone is really a federal agent, if they're undercover?" "You don't need to know," Kelly replied firmly. Military regulations prohibit assault and harassment regardless of who the target is. If you wouldn't strike a general, you shouldn't strike anyone. Captain Morrison, now Major Morrison following his promotion, had become something of an expert on proper response to incidents involving federal personnel. His handling of the Broderick situation had been studied and praised throughout the military justice system, leading to assignments in leadership development and crisis management. During a recent briefing at the Pentagon, he addressed a room full of senior officers about the lessons learned from the case. The key factor wasn't recognizing Agent Vasquez's true identity, Morrison explained. The key was immediately understanding that assault is assault, regardless of circumstances or apparent justification. Private Chun had completed his enlistment and returned to civilian life, but his role in documenting the incident had earned him recognition and job opportunities in security and law enforcement. The video he had recorded was now used in training programs across multiple agencies as an example of proper witness behavior and evidence preservation. Agent Vasquez had disappeared back into the classified world of federal operations, but her impact on military culture continued to ripple outward. New directives required enhanced protection for any personnel whose identity or assignment might be sensitive, and commanders received training on recognizing and responding to potential security compromises. The federal agencies had implemented their own changes based on lessons learned from the incident. Cover identities were now supported by more sophisticated documentation and monitoring systems, while rapid response protocols ensured that threats to protected personnel would be addressed immediately and decisively. Colonel Reeves had survived the investigation into his command, but with the understanding that his career advancement had been permanently affected by the failure to identify and address Broderick's behavioral patterns. His final efficiency report included commendable performance notes, but also observations about the need for enhanced leadership oversight. The base itself bore visible reminders of the changes that had followed the incident. Security cameras were more numerous and obvious. Training posters emphasized respect and professionalism, and the informal hierarchies that had once governed military social interactions had been replaced by strict adherence to regulation and protocol. In the military prison where Broderick served his sentence, he had become a case study in how careers could be destroyed by momentary failures of judgment and discipline. Other inmates, many of whom were serving shorter sentences for less dramatic offenses, viewed him with a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment. His wife had divorced him during the second year of his confinement, unable to bear the financial and social consequences of his conviction. Their daughter, now in college, had changed her last name and avoided any association with her father's military service or subsequent disgrace. The legal precedent established by Broderick's case had been cited in dozens of subsequent prosecutions involving federal personnel protection. Military attorneys now warned their clients that assault on federal agents, even unknowing assault, would be prosecuted with unusual severity and federal resources. Military justice experts continued to debate whether the harsh sentence had been appropriate, but the deterrent effect was undeniable. Reports of physical violence by senior personnel against subordinates had dropped dramatically across all service branches, as potential perpetrators understood the career-ending consequences of such behavior. The story had entered military folklore as a cautionary tale about assumption, authority, and accountability. New officers learned about it during leadership courses, while senior NCOs used it as an example of how quickly respect built over decades could be destroyed by seconds of poor judgment. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you. Or share if you've witnessed similar situations where someone's true authority or importance wasn't immediately obvious. Maybe you've seen how quickly respect can be lost when people let power go to their heads. As the sun set over the base that evening, the mess hall filled with soldiers eating dinner and conducting the routine business of military life. The atmosphere was more formal now, more careful, but also more professional. The casual assumption that rank determined who deserved respect had been replaced by understanding that everyone deserved basic human dignity. The empty chair where Broderick had once sat remained a silent reminder that careers built over decades could be destroyed in moments, and that the true test of leadership was not the power to intimidate others, but the wisdom to treat all people with the respect they deserved as fellow human beings. In the end, the case had achieved something that years of training and regulation had struggled to accomplish. It had created a military culture where violence was not just discouraged, but understood to be career suicide, where federal operations were protected not through secrecy, but through universal professionalism, and where the assumption that appearances told the whole truth had been replaced by the knowledge that everyone deserved respect regardless of their apparent position or importance. The legacy of 30 seconds of violence would continue to shape military culture for generations, ensuring that future leaders understood the true cost of letting anger overcome judgment and the permanent consequences of choosing intimidation over leadership.